All right, so let's go through and do some example free response questions, not only to help you get ready for the upcoming test and quiz in class, but also to help you prepare for the AP exam, because these are the kind of skills that the second part of the AP exam is going to be assessing what they're going to be looking for. And so as we go through, right, let's pick apart how to answer these free response questions. This first free response question is actually a really good example of what you can expect to see as that first question on the AP exam. The first question is always the longer question, and I can almost guarantee it's going to deal with this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. It's been that way. I think the first free response question, 9 out of the last 10 years, has asked that question. So this is almost a lock that the question is going to start something very similar to this. So as we go through, let's figure out what it is the prompt is asking, how we might answer it to earn full points. So the first thing that we want to notice, it says, assume the economy is operating at the full employment level of output and employment. So that's the first thing that we want to make sure, right, that we notice. So full employment level of output and employment. That's one of the first keys that we want to look at. Then we also want to pay attention. It says a recent sharp decline in stock market indices has reduced the wealth of the nation by about 18%. So notice a sharp decline has reduced the wealth of the nation. So that's going to be our change. Already from the prompt, we've picked up a couple key pieces of information that will hopefully guide us and help us answer this question. So part A is now going to ask us, using a correctly labeled aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, show the full employment economy. So first thing we want to do is set up our graph. Now remember, part of it is that we need to make sure everything is always labeled. That's the number one thing most students forget to do on the AP exam, is not have their graphs correctly labeled or annotated, and it becomes difficult to earn full points then. So remember, we're comparing price level to real GDP. So now everything's labeled. We need to show the full employment economy, where we are here before the crash. So remember, full employment, we're just going to say YF, full employment. So that's represented by our long run aggregate supply graph. Right, remember, that's our potential. That's our potential output at full employment. Where are we in relation to that? Well, in the short run, that's where our curves meet. So short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Right, so if this is full employment, this is our price at full employment. Part B is now asking us to take that change into account, to amend the graph, change the graph to show the short run effect of the drop in consumer wealth. All right, key thing, drop in consumer wealth. All right, that is a change in aggregate demand. So we need to make sure we're shifting the correct curve and in the right direction. It's a drop, so decrease aggregate demand. Now, one thing that people tend to freak out about is when you read in the prompt, reduce the wealth of the nation by about 18%. Don't worry about the size of this. All we're doing on the graph is trying to show the model. So we can basically ignore that 18% drop. All right, we just want to show it on the graph, that it's a decrease in aggregate demand. So what happens? Well, we now have a decrease in price level and a decrease in real GDP. All right, so what does that mean in real terms? So prices went down, real GDP went down, decreased, and unemployment, as a result, unemployment went up. Key thing to keep in mind with that, remember, unemployment and real GDP are inverse of each other, right? What happens to one, the opposite happens to the other. So GDP decreases, unemployment increases. You need to make sure you're reading that carefully as you go through. So here we've got our graph. We've amended it to show the change to include this new recessionary gap, right? And we've said what happens to price level and real GDP. So that's a good example of the first free response question. It's a little bit longer, takes a little bit longer to set up, but if you kind of know the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, you'll be in pretty good shape. Our second question, all right, is going to deal with trying to find some information about the marginal propensity to consume. So, to do this, right, we need to remember marginal propensity to consume and how to find that. And remember, the formula for marginal propensity to consume is taking the change in consumer spending or consumption expenditures over the change in disposable income. So, all we need to know is what are our changes. So, our consumer spending changed, went from 9 trillion to 10 trillion. Or, sorry, our disposable income went from 9 trillion to 10 trillion, so that's a change of 1. And consumption expenditures increased from 6 to 6.8, so 0.8. Well, anything divided by 1 is just itself, so our marginal propensity to consume would be 0.8. This is an example of a question where it's more just, do you know the definition? Do you know the formula? These will be always a part of those AP-style free response. Just a quick, easy way to assess, do you know a formula? Do you know how to calculate something quick? So in this case, our marginal propensity to consume, we need to know that's change in consumer spending over change in disposable income. We can figure those out given the information, and that shouldn't take us very long. Our third free response question says if our marginal propensity to consume is 0.6. So I'm going to keep a running list of information that we have now. 0.6. How much would the government need to spend if it desired a $25 billion increase in GDP? So let's use what we have to determine a couple of key pieces of information. So we know the MPC. Let's find now our MPS. All right? Our marginal propensity to consume plus marginal propensity to save always has to equal 1. So over here, our marginal propensity to save must be 0.4. All right? We can use that now to figure out our multiplier. 1 over MDS, or 1 over 0.4. Right? You do the math, plug it into your calculator or your phone. Hopefully you can do this in your head, but you should get 2.5. So now we've got enough information that we can start to figure this out, but it's a little bit different than some of the examples we've seen in class. Here, we know our multiplier, right, is 2.5, and we know how much we want to get to, but we know that because of that multiplier, we don't have to spend all $25 billion to fill that gap. We only need to spend a little bit and let it have its impact. Let it spread out and have that multiplied impact. So, to do this, right, we need to remember that a change in GDP is equal to the multiplier times, in this case, our change in government spending. Well, we know this, and we know this, so let's just use some math to work out and find our change in government spending. So our change in GDP is 25 billion. Our multiplier is 2.5. All we need to do now is solve for delta G. All right, divide each side by 2.5. All right, and what you should come up with, right, is $10 million. So hopefully these will help you figure out how to answer some of the free response questions as we go through, get ready for the quiz. All right, so if you have any questions, you can always email me or ask in class, and hopefully we will get you guys ready for that AP exam.